I intend to discuss interpretation, its uses and misuses. I cannot hope to give you an exhaustive exposition of this vast subject in the limited time available, but I hope to shed some light on the nature and vital importance of interpretation in analytic work. Interpretation is a powerful tool in the hands of the therapist. I should like to discuss and illustrate with examples from my clinical experience the essential importance of interpretation for furthering a patient's psychological health and growth. I shall also discuss how giving interpretations can be misused and can impede the development of a person. You will all be familiar with giving or receiving interpretations. Hence, much of what I'm going to say will be known to you. I hope that in the ensuing discussions you will contribute out of your own active and passive experience of interpretations and elucidate, expand, modify, or challenge the points which I shall make. I shall, of course, speak from a Jungian perspective, as I have no personal experience of Freudian and Kleinian ways of interpreting, except what I have gathered from books and scientific papers. I shall now briefly outline the plan of my exposition. I shall first define the nature of interpretation, its objects, its aim, and its value for the patient's development. I shall then discuss how the analyst arrives at an interpretation with special regard to his countertransference. Next, I shall consider the importance of understanding and learning from a patient's response to a given interpretation. It may be positive, negative, or there may be altogether an absence of response. Expressed in the terminology of infancy, the patient may savor the analyst's feed, or he may spit it out, or he may altogether ignore it and turn away from it. The most favorable response is if the patient chews the feed up, spits out what he doesn't want, and swallows and digests the rest. Finally, I shall discuss the timing of interpretations. This will lead me to another point, which I consider to be very important, namely contraindications for giving an interpretation and the analyst's possible misuses of interpreting. This sometimes arises out of neurotic elements in his countertransference. These different aspects, of course, overlap and will not be treated as discrete entities. Interspersed with a theoretical discussion, I shall bring you clinical material. This, I hope, will bring my theoretical points to life. First, nature, object, and aim of an interpretation. An interpretation is a statement by the analyst for the purpose of bringing into the patient's consciousness some contents of his inner world of which he is unconscious. These can include images of introjected childhood figures, unresolved edible feelings, dreams, fantasies, defenses, or an undeveloped function which has been lying dormant and has never come into play. The chief aim of making an interpretation is to bring about a shift in a person's consciousness so as to enable him to make a better adaptation to life. Interpretations can also lead to an enrichment of the patient's personality. They form a bridge between the conscious and unconscious part of the psyche. The process can be likened to a translation of language. What is expressed in the language of the unconscious becomes translated into conscious language. Freud thought that the unconscious consists of repressed impulses and memories. He was of the opinion that in order to attain psychological health, they should be made conscious. Jung, however, held the view that a large part of the psyche is and always will remain unconscious. He showed in a very convincing way that a person had a personal unconscious and that underneath this personal unconscious was a vast area consisting of primordial images and archetypal patterns. As you know, Jung called this the collective unconscious. It is common to us all and forms the basis of everybody's psyche. Thus, Jung considered the unconscious not as the dustbin of consciousness, but, on the contrary, as the storehouse of a person's riches, full of infinite possibilities for experience and of forces which can create or destroy. As interpretations bring some contents of the collective and personal unconscious into consciousness, they foster and maintain a dialectic relationship between a person's conscious mind and his personal as well as collective unconscious, and thus enrich his personality. Interpreting can be looked at as a creative act. It can be likened to the act of an interpreter of music, who makes a relationship with a composer and then gives his individual meaning to a certain piece of music. Likewise, analyst and patient, often in collaboration, may arrive at a new meaning and understanding of what is expressed by the unconscious. By making a relationship with it, they may creatively give it a meaning. An interpretation is given by the therapist and received by the patient. Thus, it also will make a bridge between them. This is very important as we consider therapy to be a dialectic process between two people, the patient and the therapist. I think you can see why interpretation has frequently been called the therapeutic instrument par excellence. As I said, more often than not, the objects of an interpretation are the images of a patient's introjected parents or of other important people in his life, and they manifest themselves in the transference. By this we mean that, for instance, the patient will transfer, that is project, qualities of the internal parental imagos onto the analyst, and will hold the erroneous view that these qualities pertain to the analyst. The images of the internal parents are composite. One part consists of what the parents were actually like. This gets overlaid by what the baby and child made them into with his feelings of love and hate for them, or on account of an innate defect in the baby, which distorted his perception of the parents. By interpreting these projections onto the analyst, we hope to give the patient a more realistic image of his parents. It will also result in the patient owning feelings which are really his. To give you an example, let us say that the patient had a depressed mother who could not contain her baby's feelings in his infancy. This will have left the patient with a delusionary feeling that his mother did not love him and that he was and still is unlovable. Moreover, in his infantile rage, he may have hated his mother and wanted to damage or even annihilate her. As an infant frequently experiences his impulses as if they were actions, he may now see himself as a person who tends to damage or even destroy the people who matter most to him. This, of course, produces a fear in him that he has damaged or destroyed his analyst, or at least his analyst's good feelings for him. Another example. The patient may have a severe critical father imago in his inner world. This will be a conglomerate of a critical father and of the patient's severe criticism of the father, who was experienced by him as unloving. As a result of this, the patient may become exaggeratedly self-critical and, in analytic parlance, develop a fierce, crippling superego. Furthermore, he may project this hypercritical father onto people in his surroundings. This will distort and damage his relationships. Last not least, he will project this attitude onto his analyst and feel convinced that the analyst severely disapproves of him. As I said, the analyst needs to interpret to the patient such transference projections. Moreover, by being reliably there for the patient in a non-critical, containing and caring way, the patient will have a new experience of a symbolic analyst parent. This will help him to use the interpretation, and gradually, as this is repeated over the years, his inner images and his perception of his parents and of his analyst will modify as I have described. This will strengthen and enrich him. It will lead to an improvement of his relationships with people in the outside world, and it will increase his trust in his analyst. Before I describe further objects of interpretation, such as dreams and defenses, I should like to discuss how the therapist arrives at an interpretation. In order to make a useful mutative interpretation, it is of paramount importance to be in very close contact with the patient and be aware of where he is psychologically speaking at a given moment. This is, of course, not only essential for arriving at a successful interpretation, it is the prerequisite for all beneficial therapy. It is imperative that the analyst is open to his own infantile instinct, conflicts and resistances, and above all in touch with his own shadow, so as to be in a position to grasp a patient's unconscious impulses. This might enable the analyst to understand what a patient unconsciously expresses by his demeanor, his tone of voice, his movements or lack of movement, his flood of words or his silences and omissions. The analyst needs to understand the patient's resistance and transferences or any contents his personal or collective unconscious throws up at any time. The analyst, therefore, must himself have, as it were, a permeable membrane between his collective and personal unconscious and the conscious part of his personality. In other words, the therapist must at all times be in a living dialogue between his conscious mind and his unconscious. This is the reason why every analytic therapist must undergo a thorough analysis himself before he can interpret unconscious contents in his patients. You may know that Jung was the first analyst to demand this prerequisite. Furthermore, being in close touch with the patient implies that the therapist is aware of the different elements of the transference which pertain at this moment with its positive and negative aspects. It is equally important that the therapist is conscious of the countertransference, the counterpart of the transference, its complement in the analyst. The analyst should become aware of what the patient's transference projections make him feel, and what images or impulses arise in him in response to them. This is indispensable for understanding the patient. It is only out of this understanding and out of this awareness that the analyst can hope to correctly interpret an unconscious content, dream or transference pertaining at that time. If the patient is in a strong negative transference, he may not be able to take in or use the interpretation of the unconscious content. The therapist may have to advise first the negative transference, make an interpretation of its meaning and work through it before he can proceed with interpretations of unconscious contents. I am now going to discuss another object of interpretations, which is unconscious defenses. These defenses have sprung up spontaneously in the patient in the past as his psyche's attempt to maintain some kind of equilibrium. They may have been essential at one time of his life, but, unbeknown to him, may now no longer serve a useful purpose. On the contrary, they may limit his perception and understanding of himself and of people in his surroundings. For instance, his environment in infancy and childhood may have been hostile to or unaccepting of certain parts of his personality. He may have had a mother or a father who could not tolerate his anger. Hence he had to deny, repress or split off his anger or project it onto other people. This will have distorted his perception of people and now of his analyst and crippled the fullness of his personality, as I have described. The patient may use all manner of defenses like projection, splitting, denial, displacement, idealization, projective identification, acting out, or narcissistic defenses. Time does not allow me to describe the nature of these various defenses. I should just like to say a few words about the defense of acting out. This frequently takes the form of a patient coming late or early for his sessions, or staying away, or coming on the wrong day, or filling the sessions with talk about work or with inconsequential chatter, etc. This is usually a defense against uncomfortable or frightening feelings. The patient defends himself by transforming these feelings into actions. By interpreting the denied feelings, the patient will become able to own them and feel more real. I shall explain the narcissistic type of defense when I discuss the misuses of interpretations. Experiencing in the here and now impulses and feelings against which he had to defend as a baby or child for all sorts of reasons will help him to get into contact with his inner world and above all his inner child, which may have become crippled by these defenses. As you know, the child in us is the growing force of our personality. Thus we hope that by interpreting, crippling and distorting defenses, we will enable the patient to bring his now freer inner child fully into play in the here and now. I shall describe to you the case of a patient who had erected a colossal unconscious defense system to protect himself from becoming conscious of a most important unconscious content which felt to him too painful to face. It was a young man who came to me just as he had graduated from an Oxford university and found himself unable to hold down a job or make relationships. The reason was that he could not bear to be in the company of women who knew the words for male genitals. He was in the throes of despair if they knew the slang words like balls or cock, but it was even unbearable for him if they knew the ordinary words for genitals. Nor could he tolerate that a girl had seen any other male's genital except his. For instance, when he found out that his girlfriend was a children's nurse and had seen a little boy's penis, he broke off the relationship. He insisted that I should promise never to read Lady Chatterley's Lover, as otherwise he would have to break off his analysis. I informed him that I had read the book, but by then he needed me too much and he was not able to carry out his threat of leaving me. It took many years of painstaking analytic work, including innumerable interpretations, until his defensive system became gradually dismantled and we could reach the fearful unconscious content against which he was defending. The unconscious content in question was his deep and utter contempt for his father. His mother and father had split up before his birth, and he had hardly ever seen his father. His mother told him that his father was a contemptible man, and she thoroughly besmirched his image. The patient felt that his mother, and therefore all women, had contempt for all men, and that must include him. He was closely identified with his mother, but fiercely defended against the recognition of his contempt for his father, and himself by the symptoms I described. After years of working through these defenses, he became able and willing to make contact with his father. He formed a good relationship to him and valued him and himself. His defensive system gradually diminished, and he could make a lasting relationship with a young woman. He also became professionally very competent, and when he finally ended his analysis, he was a wealthy man. I should now like to give you some examples of the interpretation of various types of dreams. They may be dreams which bring hitherto unconscious contents of the transference into the patient's consciousness, or they may be dreams which try to make the patient aware of underdeveloped aspects of his personality. Or they may be dreams which bring into consciousness images from the collective unconscious and thus enrich the patient's personality and his capacity for imagination. Here is an example of how a dream showed a one-sidedness in the development of a patient and helped her to redress the balance. This concerns a patient who was not much in touch with her feelings and had tried to control her life by thinking. She brought the following dream. She was on a high, bleak mountain and did not know how to get down. A simple peasant offered to guide her down. He led her to a fertile valley where she found many members of her family who warmly welcomed her. We thought that being on the high, bleak mountain represented her living in her head, which made her life feel somewhat arid. The bare mountain could, of course, also have represented the bleak breast of infancy, and in the transference, the bleak analytic breast. In actual fact, she idealized me, which may have been a defense against this experience. As a child and infant, she experienced her mother as bleak. The peasant is a healthy, earthy aspect in her, and or an aspect she experienced in the analyst, which helped her down from the lofty heights of thinking to the fertile, instinctual aspects of her personality. There she could feel close to her kith and kin. Her family can, of course, also represent the family of her internal world, a healthy discovery of essential parts of herself which had hitherto been neglected. To bring undeveloped and neglected parts of the personality into consciousness will enrich the person and contribute to his integration. Here is an example of a dream which helped considerably to throw light on an important area of blockage in a patient's psyche. This led to serious difficulties in the transference. The patient in question had been brought up by a mother who could not tolerate anger or hostility from him as an infant and as a child. When he cried as a baby, she pushed the pram to the end of the garden so as not to hear him. As a child, he was made to feel that his fragile mother would break up if he showed anger or hostility. There was no father to whom the child could turn. Not surprisingly, in his transference relationship with me, not only did he not express anger, but was completely unaware of anger or negative feelings for a long time. The transference was dominated by a great fear that I would smother him or indoctrinate him with my views, but also that he might destroy me if he ever opposed me. The analytic process was uneventful for years. I frequently referred to his denied anger for me in how he confused me with his mother, but it was to no avail. I had a feeling of dragging somebody along who did not fully come to life. The sessions had long silences. The patient was often at the verge of going to sleep, and so was I. Then he brought me an important long dream. I shall try and give you the gist of it. The patient was crossing over to an island, and to his surprise, he found there his deaf and dumb daughter, a young girl. In reality, he had no daughter. He was delighted and embraced her. We arrived together at the interpretation that the island was him living in isolation and detached from the mainland, the archetypal as well as the analyst mother. The deaf and dumb girl was an important, unrecognized part of himself. As a child, he had experienced his mother, and now in the transference, me, the analyst, as being deaf to his powerful negative feelings, to which indeed he himself was deaf. This had made him dumb, metaphorically speaking. He could not express them. Finding and embracing this part of himself initiated a significant change in his attitude to his unrecognized anger with me and with his mother, and one could say the analysis was now beginning to take off and gather momentum. This dream was soon afterwards followed by another one. In it he was making love to a monster. The monster represented his mother, whom he experienced as monstrously unhelpful, and transferred onto me, it represented the monstrously unhelpful analyst. The monster was also a metaphor of his monstrous feelings of anger, hate, murderousness, with which he was now increasingly getting into contact. These clinical examples illustrate my next point, the importance of interpreting the shadow. I expect you're all familiar with this Jungian concept. As you know, by shadow, we mean the primitive, underdeveloped aspects of the personality which were not tolerated by the infant's and child's environment. This made them intolerable to the child and to the adult he is now. They are repressed or denied. They can be feelings and impulses like hate, jealousy, envy, or any destructive feelings. They are rejected because they are unlovely, Yet they are essential for the unfolding of a full personality. Because they were rejected, they remained undeveloped. Thus they can easily fester and turn into dangerous destructive forces. These forces are frequently projected onto people in the person's surroundings or onto the world at large, and last not least onto the analyst. They distort the patient's view of people, of the world, and of the analyst. This impoverishes him and damages his capacity for loving and hating. This leads to a serious threat to his equilibrium and growth. It is essential for the person's stability and further development that these shadow qualities are brought into consciousness by interpreting them so that they can be assimilated, handled, and integrated. They constitute vital and necessary aspects of the psyche. It is most helpful for the patient if the shadow can be understood and interpreted in the transference, as this is the experience of the here and now, as I have illustrated with my clinical examples, the deaf and the monstrous analyst, and the patient's monstrous feelings towards the analyst. I shall now bring part of a dream which I think illustrates the help which can come from the collective unconscious in times of great stress. The dreamer was on the shore of the Pacific Ocean. A huge tidal wave was approaching him. He ran away and found a sanctuary in a kind of temple hewn out of the rock. There he was reunited with his wife and children. The dreamer's marriage at that time was in a precarious state. His wife did not enjoy the sexual relationship and frequently refused his approaches. He found the situation almost unbearable, yet he did not want to leave her and the children. He was longing for inner peace. Pacific Ocean, the ocean of peace. The collective unconscious gave him a warning that a huge wave of unconscious destructiveness could envelop him and sweep him away. But he found a sanctuary in a spiritual surrounding which reunited him with his family. The sanctuary could also symbolize the safe temenos of the analysis. He heeded the warning and did not break up his marriage. He is searching for a spiritual, as yet unknown force in himself, which will transcend the opposites of smashing up his marriage or staying in an instinctually highly unsatisfactory marriage. Jung calls this third force which can bridge opposite the transcendent function. The temple hewn out of rock may have represented this. I shall now give you a brief example of how a negative transference was hidden in a narrative and could be recognized and interpreted. A patient told me that he had engaged a very incompetent handyman to repair his fish pond. The man failed to get the water pump going. I was, of course, the incompetent handyman, and the patient expressed his dissatisfaction with me, of which he had not been properly aware at that time. His inner pond felt murky, and he felt that I had failed to get the spring of cleansing and renewal going. Next, I should like to give you a vignette from the analytic work with a patient, which illustrates transference interpretations. This will be followed by the interpretation of a dream of hers, which contained archetypal as well as personal elements. This dream, similar to the other patient's dream of the tidal wave, showed this patient the way at a time when she felt somewhat desperate. First, a few biographical facts about this patient, which you need to know so as to make sense of the clinical material. I shall call the patient Mrs. F. Mrs. F is a very intelligent and cultured middle-aged professional woman from a Latin European country. She has lived in this country for many years as she was married to an Englishman. He died some years ago. Her father, no longer alive, was a tall man with a wild streak in his character, who had wanted a son. Moreover, my patient should have been an archetypal hero son, who engaged in dangerous adventures, as her father had done in his youth, and who would never have a desire to be selfish. She was an only child, and being a girl was presumably a disappointment to her father, whom she idealized, like later on a male therapist who treated her before she came to me. Her mother was a powerful civil servant, working like a man in an entirely male team. She was no model for a growing girl of how to be a woman. Her mother thought she knew everything best and was a center of advice for all her friends, and last not least, showered my patient with advice in every situation. When my patient had a child, her mother moved in, ostensibly, so that Mrs. F. could pursue her profession, which took her away from home. But her mother came between Mrs. F. and her husband. In the analysis with me, it gradually emerged that her husband had wanted her more as a homosexual than a female partner. The sexual relationship between them was of little significance, and she was particularly close to his brothers, who were all homosexuals. Since her husband's death, she has had several brief and unsuccessful love affairs. They were all with men who, unbeknown to her, represented father figures to her. It would appear that they rejected her because they wanted a female partner, and neither a homosexual son nor a daughter, the two roles she was unconsciously trying to play out. Before she came to me, she had therapy from a gifted but untrained psychotherapist. She was passionately in love with him. Although he helped her to discover her female side, he could not help her resolve her passionate sexual transference. He terminated her treatment. This caused her great distress. She came to me because I was geographically accessible, but she experienced me as a pale anticlimax to her previous therapist because I was a woman. This made it clear to me that she had a problem about being a woman. Yet she never wanted to change from me to a male therapist. Perhaps she unconsciously hoped that she could learn from me how to be satisfied being a woman. In the early stages of the analysis, Mrs. F. idealized her mother. It took her a long time to discover that her mother had played a male role with her. Her mother had inseminated her as if she was a man and was not receptive as a woman. Thus my patient, when growing up, had no model of a woman who felt all right in her feminine identity. My patient was evacuated during the war as a little girl of 18 months to a small village far from home. She was looked after by a maid to whom she got very attached. This maid both loved her and beat her with a broom. Her parents visited her from time to time, but she never told them that she was being beaten. The maid frequently left her in a pub downstairs, got drunk and went upstairs to have sex with men as a prostitute. She was truly not a model for a little girl of how to be a woman. When the parents eventually discovered that the maid was a prostitute, they dismissed her. Mrs. F. was deeply distressed and searched for her for years. In the countertransference, I felt that Mrs. F. had contempt for me, though she never overtly admitted it. She fantasized that I was in a dull, monogamous marriage, combining being a wife with having a career, and that, unlike her, I was not transsexual, nor had I lived out the primitive archetypal drive for promiscuity which is in the collective unconscious of every woman. Hence she found me far removed from her ideal and rather colorless. Her father had lovers during his marriage, and she, during her marriage, had had a wild schizophrenic son-lover who was much younger than her. I interpreted to her gradually how difficult she found it to be a woman and to have a committed relationship with a man who is not willing to play a father role. She had previously turned down such a man who had offered her marriage. Her contempt for me also arose out of her envy of me. She imagined that I had achieved being a woman. Here are further transference interpretations which arose out of my countertransference feelings. Whereas with some patients I find myself quickly in tune and grasp the main elements of their psychopathology after a few months of treatment, I found it extremely difficult to make sense of this patient. She talked at me instead of to me, and then complained that I did not take her in. She also accused me of knowing everything best, like her mother. As this was far from the truth, and I had felt somewhat stupid in relation to her material, I felt that there was a mother transference at play. I ventured an interpretation. I said, "You experience me as not having a vagina, the woman's organ that can receive, just as you had experienced your mother as not having a vagina. You make me into a homosexual male partner who buggers you, as you experienced your mother when she knew everything best and told you what to do." This brought forth interesting material. She told me that she did not know that she had a physical vagina until she was in her teens. Being the intelligent daughter of intelligent parents, this unconscious denial was, of course, due to a denial of her femininity. I should like to mention here that I often give my interpretations in body language. This gets the patient more in touch with his/her body. It is also closer to the way children experience things. Children are much nearer than adults to their bodily processes, and we should like to reach the child in the patient. After this interpretation, the communication between us improved considerably, and a great deal of relevant material came to light. Whereas previously I had had great difficulties in understanding her dreams, I was now in much closer touch with her, and we could together interpret her dreams. I should now like to illustrate this with an example. She dreamt that she found herself in an important town. The town was Vienna, as she saw the tower of the Dome of St. Stephen. But it was also Paris, as she saw the Eiffel Tower. And it was London, as she recognized the post office tower. She is being guided by a man. She is with her daughter, who in the dream was a little girl. In reality, she is grown up. She began to doubt whether the male guide was genuine, or whether he was laying a trap for her and intended to kidnap her. She became increasingly convinced of the danger and got very frightened. She desperately wanted to get away from the man, but her little girl refused to leave. She woke up in a panic. Now the interpretation. Her life circumstances at that time were that several months ago she had passionately fallen in love with a tall man. He did not return her feelings. They met a few times, and then he did not want to see her again. This had happened to her before with other men, and she had got over it without too much difficulties. This time she was utterly distressed, and she became completely obsessed with this man. They had not had a sexual relationship, but he had once held her in his arms, as her husband's homosexual brother had done many years ago. She was continuously reliving this memory and pining for him. Mrs. F. was truly besotted by him. It emerged that he was tall, had a kind of inner independence, and had a motherly side, all attributes of her father. I said he represents a mummy-daddy or a breast penis in the language of infantile experience. She readily agreed. Now to the symbols in the dream. They are both archetypal, which means coming from her collective unconscious, and personal from her personal unconscious. A town could be seen as an archetypal female symbol, as it is a container. The child sees her mother as the container of babies. Towers are, of course, archetypal phallic symbols. The man's name was Stephen, and the Dome of St. Stephen represented this combination of mother and father, which he experienced in him. Mother Church with a high phallic steeple. Being a church, it also has a spiritual aspect. It is the religious center of the town. The town in the dream was also Paris, with the Eiffel Tower, the phallic symbol of Paris. Mrs. F. loves Paris. She sees it as the center of the arts. She is very artistic, and the man was an artist. It was also London, with the post office tower, the tower of worldly communication. She desperately wanted to communicate with Stephen. These three towns represent three important aspects of herself: the spiritual, artistic, and worldly aspect. This showed that Stephen represented a sort of totality to her. Her longing for him could be understood as a longing for the wholeness of her own self. This wholeness is the aim of individuation. The little girl who is with her in the dream is her internal little girl that wants to be guided by the father/mother man. However, her unconscious is beginning to recognize that hankering after this man is a trap for her. She is in danger of being kidnapped, of losing her inner freedom, as she feels enthralled by him and in his bondage. Although in the dream she recognizes the severe danger of the situation, she cannot detach herself from him. She wants to get away before she is being kidnapped, but the little girl part of her does not recognize the danger and wants to stay. As we arrived at this interpretation, she could see that unless she detached herself inwardly from this man, she was in danger of losing her independence and selfhood, and that she must not be guided by the wishes of the little girl inside her. Her unconscious gave her a most important warning. It also helped her to understand why she was so fixated to this man. Now I shall return to the theoretical discussion. I shall discuss the importance of understanding a patient's reaction to a given interpretation. This is an important pointer towards understanding the transference. The analyst must note whether the interpretation is rejected, contradicted, or simply not being heard. In metaphorical physical language, is it being experienced as a good or poisonous feed, or is it experienced as being inseminated or buggered by the analyst's penis? It is, of course, possible that an interpretation was actually off the mark. The difficulty for the therapist is to understand whether this was the case, or whether the patient rejects the interpretation on account of a negative transference prevailing at this moment. As I mentioned before, an interpretation, especially if arrived at by shared effort, can be experienced as linking therapist and patient. But inasmuch as it tells the patient something he did not know, it also separates, and as such it is often disliked and rejected by the patient. It also frequently arouses envy. As one of my patients put it, "How dare you know something about myself which I don't know? I hate you for it." It can also be experienced as a betrayal, particularly if the interpretation confronts the patient with something unpleasant. For instance, he may have experienced you to be on his side, perhaps even in a cozy fusionary state, and you suddenly take up an opposite or confrontative position. Thus, the patient's reaction is an important indication about the transference pertaining at that time. As to the correctness of interpretations, I do not think that we can ever claim with certainty that an interpretation is correct. Indeed, often many different interpretations would be equally true. But although we hope that the interpretation was not too far off the mark, we should never insist on its correctness. We should allow the patient to give his view with regard to a dream or any other unconscious content. This will engage him in a dialogue with his therapist and avoid the feeling that he is being treated as a child. This brings me to a further point, the timing of an interpretation and, most important, the misuses of interpretation, contraindications to giving an interpretation. Rucker, in his important book called Transference and Countertransference, which many of you will know, makes the following statement, quote, "An interpretation must be given when the analyst knows what the patient does not know, needs to know, and is capable of knowing." End of quote. I fully agree with this statement, but I want to discuss the controversial part of it, namely how to determine whether at any given time the patient is capable of knowing what the analyst interprets. In my experience, there are certain kinds of patients in certain times in their therapy when being given an interpretation can be damaging to them. This, I found, is for instance the case with patients who suffer from severe narcissistic disorder. I have made a special study of this disorder, but time does not allow me to share this with you in depth. Suffice it to say that at the root of this disorder lies a catastrophic fit between the baby and his infancy mother. Hence, such a patient will equally keep the analyst at arm's length as he did his very unsatisfactory mother. He frequently creates an abyss between himself and the analyst. This is because he cannot trust and is terrified of his extreme neediness. Such a patient cannot love himself or others. He also cannot own his personal hate. In severe cases, he is flooded by his own shadow qualities and suffers from cosmic hate. As the analyst is seen as part of the impersonal cosmos, he is experienced by the patient as hateful. One such patient called me a stupid, useless monster during the entire first year of treatment. She had a severely damaged infancy, and her mother, who was mad, could not provide the containing environment which is essential for a baby's emotional development. The patient became controlling and a do-it-yourself mother who could not trust anybody nor relate to anybody, and that of course included me. An essential part of her personality was stagnated. She had not been helped to develop her capacity for personal loving and hating. Hence she urgently needed me to provide a containing, holding environment so that the stagnated parts of her personality could be reached and she could gradually learn to trust, to love, and to hate. I learned from bitter experience that whenever I interpreted that the monster she saw in me was part of her monstrous hate for me, she stormed out of the room and stayed away at least for 2 sessions. As she was never far from despair and from committing suicide, this of course caused me great anxiety. It took several years of therapy until she felt sufficiently contained and in touch with her good parts to tolerate interpretations of her shadow qualities and could feel loved and valued with them. Thus I had to be extremely selective in what interpretations I made. I could sometimes interpret to her that the good she saw in other people was part of her own goodness, and I could make some reconstructive interpretations which reached the damaged baby in her. But I had to refrain from interpreting aspects of herself which were at that time totally unacceptable to her. But also with less severely damaged patients, the analyst must at times refrain from interpreting. For instance, he must beware of giving interpretations out of his negative countertransference. When the analyst feels rejected, denigrated, and rendered powerless by the patient, and this is by no means an uncommon experience, there is the temptation for the analyst to reassure himself of his potency by making an interpretation. This is so as to prove to himself and to the patient that he has a full breast or a potent penis, to put it in analytic language. This is a counterproductive attempt by the analyst to restore his self-confidence. Needless to say, the patient will not be able to take in and digest such an interpretation. Also, a situation may arise where a patient is deeply regressed and needs for some period of time to experience some state of fusion with the analyst mother, which he perhaps never had with his own mother. At such a time, it would be destructive to disturb prematurely such an experience by giving interpretations. Here is a vignette out of the analysis of one such patient. He has had a controlling, manic, and intrusive mother who, it appears, could not tolerate him as a baby and could not tune into his needs. This made it important for him to be allowed to regress to feeling a baby in the analysis, and during that time he found my interpretations most unhelpful. One day there was a fly buzzing around in the consulting room. He became frantic, as if threatened by a dangerous animal, and he could talk about nothing else. 2 days later, some workmen were hammering away in the house. I found this very disturbing, whereas the patient did not mind in the least. He said, "The fly is intrusive like my mother was, and like I experience your interpretations. The hammering makes me feel good. My analyst's house is being repaired." He had felt that his wealth of destructive feelings for me had damaged me, and he wished to repair me. I complied with his wishes and refrained from interpreting for several months. When he felt sufficiently contained and could differentiate my intervention from those of his intrusive, unhelpful childhood mother, I could resume interpreting. I hope that I have been able to show you the essential role interpretations play in analytic work, be they interpretations of the transference, of the patient's unconscious defenses, of dreams, or of any other unconscious material he brings. But I also hope that I have convincingly shown the misuses of interpretations. For instance, there are times when a patient is flooded by his shadow qualities and is quite unaware of his own goodness. At such times, interpretations are unacceptable and even damaging to him. I trust that the ensuing discussion will throw more light on the points I have made and include areas which I could not cover in the time at my disposal.